So now we understand the data that is contained on the payment card. We now need to understand how that data is used to facilitate the processing of a payment. When you take your magnetic stripe card, for example, and you pull that through a magnetic stripe reader, as I said, it extracts the data on that card, it reads the data, but most importantly, it takes the PAN. Now, I've mentioned the PAN is the most important item for the processing of payments because it is your primary account number. It is the number for the cardholder to indicate where their account is, which issuer has provided that card, and which bank account within the issuer that is as the cardholder's bank account. The first 6 digits on that primary account number is known as the IIN, the Issuer Identification Number. So it identifies globally and uniquely who that issuer is, sometimes also known as the BIN, the BIN, the Bank Identification Number. The remaining digits after those first 6 digits identify the bank account for the individual within that particular issuer, except for the last digit, which is a check digit that detects if there is a single digit error in case somebody's typing out these values into a keyboard, or for example, you stripe it and there's an error in reading that value correctly. When we perform the process of authorizing a transaction, making a transaction, the transaction can be approved in an online or an offline mode. When we approve a transaction online, that's where you take your card, you pull it through the magnetic stripe reader, it is then sent from the merchant's payment terminal through to the merchant's acquiring bank. The merchant's acquiring bank looks at the issuer identification number, the IIN, decides who the issuer is, sends it through to the issuer. The issuer determines who the individual bank account is through the remaining digits of the PAN, detects whether there's enough money, whether I've provided the right details, for example, the right PIN if it's a PIN transaction, and then authorizes the transaction. Yes, no, either one is a valid authorization, it's just positive authorization or negative authorization. And that is then sent all the way back to the merchant. In that context, the transaction is approved online. That transaction data has been routed all the way through to the issuer for the issuer to make that decision. In an offline approved transaction, the issuer does not make the decision about the authorization. In this context, either the merchant or perhaps the acquirer makes the decision on behalf of the issuer. Now, why would this happen? This might be because, for example, there is a case where there is limited connectivity. You could imagine if you're on a ship or if you're on a plane, you might have a payment terminal that does not connect and cannot connect through to the issuer. So if you're making a purchase there, then perhaps the purchase needs to be approved on the spot in an offline mode without being sent online, and then later on it is validated that this transaction is okay. Now these transactions, these offline approved transactions, sometimes also known as on-us transactions, because the risk for the transaction is borne by the merchant or the acquirer, whoever is making the decision. And that is why most often these offline approved transactions are usually low value transactions. So they might be ticketing machines, they might be machines that serve certain purposes in remote locations that don't have connectivity, but don't really have a high volume, don't really have a high ticket amount, so the risk of approving the transaction offline is very low. There are also different payment transaction types. So in a payment transaction as a purchase, generally you're requesting for funds to be moved from the issuing bank to the acquiring bank, as I mentioned. That is a payment transaction or a funds transfer request. In a general purchase, this can either take part as a single message system or a 2-message system. In a single message system, basically the issuing bank is informed. Please make this transaction and transfer this amount of money from your bank account to the merchant's bank account. In a 2-message system, there is more of a conversation that goes on. The acquiring bank asks first, this person wants to make a purchase, do they have enough money? The issuing bank then responds, hopefully yes, that person does have enough money. Then the acquiring bank might say, okay, please transfer that money because that purchase has been made. Now, depending on the geography, some systems use a single message, some use a double message. You might be familiar with double message systems in the context of perhaps a hotel, where when you turn up to the hotel and you swipe your card or you insert your card, they put a hold on some funds in your account. They have authorized that transfer, but they haven't completed that transfer. So it's a payment authorization and then a funds complete authorization. You then have other types of transactions that might occur based on international standards, and the most common international standard used in payments is ISO 8583, although that's changing over time, and we'll talk about that in the future lecture later on. We also have a concept of authorization and settlement. So authorizing a transaction, even if you've asked in a single message for those funds to be transferred, doesn't necessarily transfer the funds straight away. What happens is those funds are reserved. You can imagine if you have two large banks, they might have messages going back and forth all day, where there might be millions of dollars of funds being transferred from Bank A to Bank B, and then also millions of dollars being transferred from Bank B to Bank A. Rather than having that process occur all the time in real time, they batch up that amount, and at the end of the day, they settle. And Bank A might say, I owe you 2 million, Bank B might say, I owe you 1.5 million, and only $500,000 is then transferred across between the banks during the settlement process. This is why when you make a transfer or you make a payment, sometimes although the amount is debited from your account immediately, it may not go into the merchant's account straight away. So the merchant account itself can be part of an overall ledger system. You might have a merchant that has their own account, or a merchant that is part of a ledger system where the service provider actually has an account, and then the merchant has a specific ledger entry within that particular account, and funds are moved back and forth based on that ledger. At the end of the day, the process is the same, and the settlement process is the same as well.